I'd like to take a minute to tell you about the Parent Catalyst Leadership Group, also known as PCLG. We are parents and caregivers of children and youth who experience mental health challenges. As stakeholders, we advocate for families as part of the Hennepin County Children's Mental Health Collaborative. Our mission is to empower Hennepin County families to become valued advocates and decision makers at all levels through education, outreach, and support. Besides hosting workshops like this one, we offer a monthly support group on the second Thursday of every month at 7 p.m. And we work with our partners to improve the mental health system for all. If you'd like to learn more, please contact us. Next, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jill Lee Hubble. She has served as faculty in several council education programs since 2011 and has developed, implemented, and evaluated counseling curricula for clinical mental health, addiction, co-occurring, and school counseling programs. In her clinical work, Dr. Lee Hubble has provided mental health and substance use counseling services in schools, primary care, and hospitals, as well as residential and outpatient settings. As a clinical supervisor and program manager, she has implemented and evaluated programs across schools, medical clinics, and residential treatment settings. Dr. Lee Hubble is dedicated to supporting the field of counseling through her teaching and supervision practices and believes all children can thrive with social and emotional support at home and school. Welcome, Dr. Lee Hubble.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. All right. So should we just get going? I know there's still some people entering in. Do you want me to just proceed, Melanie? Okay. I can do that. Well, thank you for joining me tonight, everybody. What a great group to be advocating for and presenting for. I'm Jill Lee Hubble. My current position is at Washburn Center for Children in Minneapolis. I am one of the 5 school-based mental health supervisors that we have at Washburn. And tonight we're going to be talking about school avoidance, sometimes referred to as school refusal. It's a topic that is very prevalent amongst all of our schools across all of the districts right now. We have a lot of young ones struggling. Let me just make sure my tech is working right. Am I sharing okay? All right, thank you. Okay, so at Washburn, this is what we do. We want to nurture communities, children, and families to reach their full potential. So extra excited to be here because this really tonight really supports the mission of Washburn Center for Children. So we have a pretty limited amount of time tonight, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly with the hope that it generates some questions and that there's definitely time at the end to answer some of your questions. Oftentimes when we're talking about school avoidance, there is a general sense of frustration from the school because they're worried about what's going on with the child and how much school the child is missing. Frustration from the parents because they're working really hard to get their child to school. They're working with school oftentimes, or others in the community, and they're the ones who are often having the battles every day at home trying to get their child to engage in their school day. But what we really want to make sure that we remember is that at the root of school avoidance is a child trying to tell us something that they don't have the emotional or cognitive maturity to really verbalize to us. And so while the behaviors may present as disobedient or obstinate or defiant, that's not really the root of what is causing the child to not want to engage in school or leave the home. Or when they do leave the home and they get to school, they spend all day at the nurse's office, or they want to come home right before lunch or right before recess. What's underlying school avoidance the vast majority of the time, not 100%, but we'll say the vast majority of the time, is some kind of anxiety. So, we're going to talk tonight about the anxiety process. We're going to talk about what parents can do at home, some tips that we use as therapists to try to help children engage in their environment a little bit. But want to be real clear that, what we're talking about here is the externalization of a really, really tough internal experience that children are having. One of the questions I get a lot is, so has it always really been this bad? Or did the pandemic make it worse? And the answer is yes. Yes, the pandemic made it worse. Children were uh, oftentimes very rapidly removed from their normal daily routine with going to school. There was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of stressed out, worried, scared adults. And then they were home for a long time in a child's life. If you think, in kindergartners in March of 2020, they were 5, maybe 6. So they had 6 years of life experience. They were in their first year of school. And they didn't even make it through the whole year before this big thing hit. And then they had about a year of not being in school, not learning routines, not learning how to be students. Older kids also missed out on a lot of those learning experiences for how to navigate complicated social situations and engaging with adults in kind of what we would call typical ways. So the pandemic absolutely has made school refusal worse. And we're working really hard right now to help children overcome some of the issues that have been created as a result. When we talk about school refusal, so it depends on kind of the literature that you're reading. Sometimes they'll just say it's school avoidance. Other times they'll actually say it's school refusal. I think both are accurate terms, so I'll kind of jump between the two terms throughout the talk a little bit. But the main thing, um, when we think about any child's behavior, whether they're a 5-year-old or they're a 15-year-old or a 17-year-old, because we see a lot of school refusal from adolescents as well, there's always an avoidance component to why they don't want to go to school or why they want to come home from school. And that avoidance is a key element of anxiety. And initially, what we see happen is the avoidance is really difficult to detect, very easy to miss because the child's internalizing it an awful lot. And a lot of times, their avoidance is really kind of stealthy. And over time, because we don't really realize that this is an avoidance technique, we tend to unintentionally reward it. So, oh, your tummy has hurt for 3 days. What's going on with you? It's again, it's subtle. Or you've been to the nurse 3 times this week. Is everything going, okay? Yeah, no, now my tummy feels fine. But the child doesn't really have enough insight to understand that their tummy feels funny because emotionally they're feeling really hyper aware, or their central nervous system has a lot of activation going on. They just know their tummy hurts. So it's kind of stealthy in that way. Um, and what tends to happen is there's some kind of event. It could be lunch, recess, bullying. I have had kids literally have a response to a color on the walls in a room that triggers this response, and this somatic feeling, this tummy ache, this headache, or just this desire to not be in the space. It can be sensory overload, lights being too bright. And then eventually their central nervous system just keeps kind of climbing this ladder and getting more and more activated. And after a pretty long amount of time, we start to actually see the behaviors. We start to see hiding under desks, fighting, avoiding by kind of arguing at home so that they miss the bus. They will, suddenly have to go to the bathroom, leave the classroom a lot to go to the bathroom. They'll have some difficulty separating from caregivers. And what's really kind of important to remember is that by the time we see that they're actually using some avoidance techniques, they've been feeling anxious about something that is happening, something related to school or something related to separating from their primary caregiver for quite a while. It isn't something that's necessarily new. Now, with the pandemic, we don't have real good research on if it was maybe already kind of underlying, and some kids were more susceptible than other kids were. What resiliency factors there were. But I think that's kind of we use the word unprecedented all the time. So we're talking about school refusal and school avoidance in general, not just because of the pandemic. So there's a lot of ways that we kind of try to get at if the child's maybe actually having like a physical problem and there are some like medical concerns or other things that we need to look at that's causing the school refusal, or if it is actually school avoidance. And so there's some assessments that therapists and some school counselors, school social workers, depending on their comfort level, might administer just to make sure that we're not missing anything that's actually medical, because again, they don't have the insight to always tell us what that experience is. So we're always looking at both the mental health as well as the physical health. And that brings us to talking a little bit about, so when we're talking about school refusal, that's the external behavior, but what is happening underneath? What are those internal workings of anxiety? So, on a daily basis, we all experience anxiety, and anxiety is a superpower. Anxiety makes sure that the saber-toothed tiger doesn't get us when we are out hunting or gathering. Um, we have, our brain is designed for survival, and anxiety is our survival response. When we learn how to harness the power of our anxiety to motivate us to perform really well, it does become one of our superpowers. However, sometimes anxiety gets out of control, and then it can kind of undermine our ability to be successful or to thrive. So we're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to go through this really quick because this is typically like a hour and a half long lecture in and of itself. But we're just going to very quickly talk about like what are the components of anxiety. The reason I want us to review these components of anxiety is because when we start talking about what can I do about school avoidance, how can I help this young person want to be at school or feel safe being at school, we need to really understand all the processes that we can't see, all the things that are happening internally for the young person. So there's kind of three components that are um, causing anxiety to happen, and they all work together like cogs and wheels. So you have a psychological, a physiological, and a cognitive component to anxiety. So we're going to break those down a little bit. And as I'm talking about this, if you can think about a young person who has had some kind of school avoidance, or maybe they just like avoid other things, right? We'll talk a little bit about fawning, but not right away. So we're going to hold that image of that kiddo in your head and think about them as I'm kind of going through this. We'll start talking a little bit about the emotional changes. People are pretty aware of the fight, flight, and freeze response, right? So the emotional changes when somebody's central nervous system is being activated is they could become really angry. We all become a little bit angry. That happens, it's normal. But when we talk about anxiety, we're talking about rage, we're talking about explosive outbursts that are bigger than what are manageable by the adults in the room. We also have fear, and fear is also a normal response, but panic and terror is a whole different level. Panic and terror is oftentimes we can see it in the eyes. They're almost glossed over. They're not really connecting with you. You're speaking to them, but it doesn't really look like it's getting in there. And that's the brain's way of protecting itself by shutting down. Okay. And then we have this kind of numbing out, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. And that's this emotional paralysis. There's an avoidance, like my brain has determined I have no power to do anything right now, and therefore I'm going to avoid. All right. So we're all pretty familiar with fight, flight, and freeze, which is what I basically just talked about. But what we're oftentimes not thinking about that is definitely happening is the arousal system that happens physiologically. So when we think about physiological changes, we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system. And when somebody experiences an anxiety producing situation, whether that anxiety is all in their head, like their thoughts are causing them anxiety, or it is something in their environment, their sympathetic nervous system is going to start to become really, really active. It's going to increase blood flow and nutrients to the brain. The heart rate's going to increase. Lungs are going to increase respirations. Muscle tone is going to start to really increase. This is where you start to see kids that, right? They're not speaking real clearly. They can't really breathe. Um, they're very hyper aware what's going on around them, and that's because their sympathetic nervous system is kind of in overdrive. Then there's also their parasympathetic nervous system. Now, typically, this is your rest and digest system. When we have a lot of anxiety, one of the things that happens is the the parasympathetic nervous system turns off. And so when I say turns off, what I'm talking about is your GI system starts to slow down, right? Because you let's just be honest here, you don't want to have to poop when the saber-toothed tiger is chasing you. You want to have a very slow, not functioning GI system when you're running away from a saber-toothed tiger. You really don't need your immune system because when you're under that kind of threat, it's short lived. There's not going to be anything that's more dangerous in your environment than that saber tooth tiger. You have no need for intimacy. And so I want to just like pause with the intimacy part because remember, that's that parent child relationship. That's a very, or a primary caregiver child relationship. It's a very intimate relationship. But when that central nervous system is so activated, when the sympathetic nervous system is so activated, that parasympathetic nervous system is actually kind of shutting down. So the intimacy being off is kiddos saying some pretty mean stuff and oftentimes some really hurtful stuff because of the fear and the anxiety and because they don't have the functioning to filter out, I'm going to hurt this person who loves me, right? As adults we have some more ability to do that, but as a child you don't, and as an adolescent I think it's just gone until maybe they're like 30, I don't know, but for some reason it gets really bad around 15, 16, 17. um so we have this kind of activation of the sympathetic nervous system, deactivation of the parasympathetic nervous system. And then what kind of happens is when we start to experience this kind of anxiety state for a long time, we have a decrease in our sleep. It takes longer for us to fall asleep. We get a lot less restorative sleep. And then sleep and fatigue are two different things. Sleep is a biological process. Fatigue is kind of an outcome of this. So your fatigue increases, and we're going to see why your fatigue increases in just a minute here. When your body and your mind starts to become fatigued, you start to get cravings. What do you crave? Well, we always crave some kind of stimulant, right? So we start drinking more coffee. We start looking for simple carbohydrates and we push our blood sugar up. Okay. We're pushing the blood sugar up because we're fatigued and our body really thinks that we need more. And it's not just a little bit of increase in blood sugar, it's a lot of increase in blood sugar. Well, what happens when we have an increase in blood sugar? We get an increase of insulin. We get an increase of insulin, and all of a sudden now our blood sugar drops. If anybody's familiar or has a loved one who has diabetes, You can often tell when somebody's blood sugar is too low because their mood goes off and they get really cranky. Um, and that's just one of those biological components. So when you're in this kind of state, and your blood sugar's dropping, now you're fatigued, but this is happening over and over and over again. Um, your mood is really dysregulated. Your ability to control your emotions is dysregulated. Not just when you're trying to leave the house and get in the car or get on the bus, not just when you're trying to walk through the door of the school, but once you get into the building, your body has been overstimulated all morning and you're fatigued. How are you going to learn? How are you going to pay attention? How are you going to stay on task if this is happening to you every single morning, 5 days a week? Right. So then the other kind of cog in the wheel here is cognition. And this is kind of how we think, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to avoid. I don't like this. I don't want to be there. Right. So children, especially with, given kind of depending on how mature they are, avoidance will probably be one of the first coping mechanisms that they use. They're also going to have a lot of internal distractions. They're thinking a lot. They're trying to figure out what they're going to do. Right. Sometimes these internal distractions are intrusive memories. Oh, that kid down the hall. Oh, I just saw him by the lockers. They're here today. I hope they're not going to beat me up. I hope they're not going to threaten me. Right. And then that's all they can think about. This kind of leads to some rumination. Rumination is when you have these intrusive memories and then you have these anticipatory worries. So you're thinking about the past and then you're worrying about how that past is going to start to play out. You're not paying attention to your teacher talking when your brain is doing this. And again, you're thinking about, how do I escape this? How do I get away from this? How do I avoid these feelings? When we have these kind of anticipatory worries and this rumination going on, we start to develop these cognitive distortions. And when I'm working with the littles, what I'll talk about is our brain is really amazing. Our brain makes up stories all day long. And the reason it makes up stories is sometimes there's these little gaps in our understanding. And our brain kind of tries to fill in our gaps of these understandings, like when we're worrying about something because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And when we do that, our brain is really good at it. It can tell some pretty good stories, and we call that catastrophic thinking. So the more anxious someone is, the longer they experience anxiety, the more they're going to kind of go through this cognitive cycle. And this is going to also lead into the fatigue. So when we look at this picture all together, these are the things that are happening for every single child who experiences school avoidance, not just on the day that their tummy hurt, but for several days prior to that and in an ongoing manner. So instead of having the experience where they can just calm down, feel safe, get up the next day and do it again, get up the next day and do it a little bit different, they've been experiencing this for so long that this has become a habit for them. And by the time you're seeing those external behaviors, this has been going on for quite some time. So when we talk about what can caregivers do, what are some of the interventions that you can do to try to help move the child back into kind of going to school and a little bit easier time transitioning from home to school or from caregiver into the building? What we're really going to be focusing on is things that are going to address all the stuff that you can't see. Because if the root problem is really something that happened long, quite a bit longer ago than when you first started seeing the behaviors, then that means that we have to get into the root cause, and that is that overactivation of the central nervous system, specifically that sympathetic nervous system. One thing I always like to tell parents is you cannot do this alone. This is something that you need the school to be in communication with you about. Um, in all my years as a teacher, then as a school counselor, and then as school-based mental health, then now as a school-based mental health supervisor, all these I won't say how long. We don't need to age me. For all these years, there has been one thing that has not changed because of the pandemic. And that is that the people in that building care about every single kid who walks through that door. They may get a little frustrated, just like parents get a little frustrated. They may feel like they're not able to reach the kid, and that may be really hard for them, just like it can be really hard for a parent to feel like they can't help their child. Um, and so, recognizing that you do have a support system there, bridging some communication really is your first step in letting the school know we're having this problem. We are trying to work on it. I need some help. I will also say that, educators, school counselors, school social workers, admin, they are trained and they do understand school avoidance. They do understand what's causing school avoidance. And they do, in general, they do know how to approach it to try to help the student get back on track. But it is a long and difficult road for some people. So when we talk about how do we help this kiddo start to re-engage in school, the first thing we need to think about is we got to start with the adults. We have to make sure that our frustrations, our worries, our fears are out of this column on the left, where there's kind of a judgmental column, and we kind of move it over to this right hand column, which is a very curious stance. Um, so instead of thinking that the child's being defiant, we get really curious, like what can it be that's stressing them out? What's kind of causing them to respond to their environment this way? We start asking questions, but those questions really need to start at the adult level. What do you see happening in the classroom? What have you heard about this kiddo? How does this kiddo show up in peer relationships or with friends? Are they eating in the lunchroom? So those again are very adult conversations. And when those conversations happen, they really do need to come from that place of wonder, the place of curiosity. Once we start as adults to get a better picture of what is going on, then we need to identify what adult is in the best position to start talking to the child about their experiences and what their barriers are. And then there's just a lot of communication that has to go back and forth between everybody just to kind of start to understand what is happening, or what did happen to lead to where we are, where the child is not wanting to attend school. Um, I also just want to kind of acknowledge that parenting was hard before the pandemic. It's really hard now after, but it is getting better. And so in order to start this process, we need to make sure that the parent does their work first. So the parent works on calming their own central nervous system. The parent practices some skills so that they can teach the skills to the child efficiently, and model them. Because what our kids listen to is not our words. I mean, that's literally like Charlie Brown, wah, 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 all day long. But what they do pick up on is how we move through our day. They pick up on our tone. They pick up on our rate of speech. They pick up on that difference between that judgmental language and that curiosity language. And so when the parent starts to develop a lot of confidence in that, the kiddo is going to take that as a signal that something's going to change and it's going to be good. The other thing is, I want to just acknowledge too, it's exhausting for the family when you have a child who has school refusal. And so taking a little bit of time for yourself, sometimes we really need permission to do that. So I give you all permission to take care of yourself for a few minutes and get your stuff kind of calmed down so you can really be present. With that in mind, we talked a little bit earlier about schools being a good partner. You have other partners as well who really do understand school avoidance, school professionals, nurses, school counselors, but also pediatricians and primary caregivers. Oftentimes, parents don't think that their pediatrician is the person that they would go to for this. But pediatricians are a great ally in this situation and can really help parents navigate some of the um, kind of reintegration stuff. We'll talk a little bit more about other things that they do in a little bit. Okay, so parents, you guys have taken care of yourself. You've given yourself a little bit of a great break. You've had a vulnerability moment. You've given yourself some grace because you're a good parent. This is not bad parenting. This is just the thing that happened, and you're going to get through it. And so is your child. It doesn't feel like it, but you will. Okay. So now we need to talk about, okay, so parent is ready, caregiver is ready. What are we going to do? The first and most simple complex thing to do is to really become routine oriented. Routine is one of the most prolific ways of calming the central nervous system when there's an overactivation, when we have anxiety. Routines are predictable. Routines have structure to them. The brain knows I'm going to do this, this is going to happen, and then this will happen. A plus B equals C. When the central nervous system doesn't have to think real hard and it's just going through a routine over and over again, that central nervous system doesn't feel the need to have those responses that we were talking about in that other slide. And it also helps not just decrease the anxiety part, but it also improves sleep and energy. So, and when I talk about routine, there's morning routines. Sometimes you're going to want to draw it out, use the sticker charts, use the check mark charts, help them kind of see and predict, right? We want to disrupt the rumination process with something concrete like pictures or words. This is our morning routine. The hardest part about a morning routine is sticking to it because they will push back against it. Evening routines are also very, very important. So having a calendar posted for the month where you mark off the day at the end of the day, be able to look forward to what is happening tomorrow. That's going to automatically reduce that anxiety. Packing all of the things that they need for the next morning in their backpacks the night before rather than the morning of. It sounds really simple, but it's one less thing to worry about in the morning. I mean, if you really want to go for it, you could also lay out clothes. Now, if you have my daughter, you can lay out clothes with the anticipation that she'll still change 4 times in the morning before she goes to school. But at least you've started the routine to kind of set the stage for the brain to not have to be so worried and ruminating and thinking about the future all the time. Another intervention that can be really helpful is having really very strong boundaries with love. Oftentimes, when I'm working with parents, they are, or caregivers, we are at the point where the child cannot go to school yet, where there is just too much activation, and the harder we push, the worse we're making it. It is okay when there's communication between the primary caregiver and the school to come up with a plan on how we're going to do reintegration. If you have a school-based mental health therapist, that can also be really, really helpful. But school social workers and school counselors also have a lot of training in working with school avoidance. So what the research really shows is helpful when a child is staying home is that there are very, very strict boundaries. What we want to do is we want to make home during the hours of school not be fun. We don't want it to particularly feel comfortable. We kind of want it to feel a little uncomfortable. Don't want to reward the staying home. Now, the hardest part about this is it's a really long day. If you are home alone with a child who doesn't want to go to school and they don't have any access to their iPad, to audiobooks, like no access to any of the things that they would normally have. But again, we're challenging that brain to not want to stay home. We don't want home to be the thing. We want school to be the fun place to go. And then in addition to that, we also have to think about, okay, so school hours are this, but non-school hours are fun and friends and typical, so that the brain starts to make that structure and make that routine. Oftentimes, parents feel really frustrated, and it feels like the best approach is to use some kind of punishment. Like, if you don't go to school today, you're not allowed to play with your friends after school. The problem with that is, and when you look at kind of the developing brain, the consequence is too late in the day. So we need those consequences to be immediate and during the time frame that they're supposed to be at school. If you kind of put those in that order, um, typically you will see them ready to go to school faster than if they're doing like schoolwork at home on an iPad, because then it just kind of becomes online learning, which for some students is great, but for other students is not what people are hoping for them. The other thing that can be super helpful is finding ways to increase the child's self confidence. Um, we'll talk in just a couple minutes here about what are some of the diagnoses that we often see with school avoidance. But increasing self confidence is, again, another evidence backed, research backed approach to helping children attend school more. And so that's a lot. Self confidence is not about saying, "Oh, you did so good. Oh, look at how beautiful that picture is," or "You read that whole book. Wow." Those are kind of judgments. What you really want to do is you want to like validate. Validation is what is going to increase confidence. So I see you, right? I'm catching you being good, saying things like, "Wow, I see you spent a long time working on your math homework today. I'm not judging you if you did good or not. I'm just saying, I noticed that you did that. I noticed that you did the work. I saw you pick up your dishes after you ate lunch and put them in the sink. I saw you do these things." So, what we're looking for when we do these kind of catching them being good to build self confidence, this is from the Nurtured Heart approach. I do have a slide at the end with some references that reference the Nurtured Heart approach if you're interested in learning more about that. But what it does is it helps build an internal locus of control. In other words, when you validate what you're seeing them do right, they start to feel like they are capable of making good decisions. When you tell a child, "Good job," they think that they need other people to tell them if they're doing it correctly or not. So they're always going to wait to respond to you instead of having that agency to act in the right way on their own. The other way to build confidence is to really encourage the child to do their own big things, right? And given that, we're talking about age range from 5 to 17 here for the most part. So that's going to look different across those developmental levels. But one of those things is teaching them how to make breakfast. And when I say that, and I say set that up for success, I mean so that you don't have an enormous like milk spill or something to clean up afterwards that's going to stress you out before they get out the door. So easy things that you kind of pre-prep that they put together. Um, Self-confidence is one of those things with anxiety that it's kind of one of the earliest hits and one of the biggest hits that happens when a child develops anxiety. So we want to make sure that they're developing some resilience by increasing their self-confidence. Another intervention is therapy. um, Family therapy is oftentimes our starting place because we need the parents to help us understand their child. um, we also need to provide some support to the parent so the parent feels like they have the agency, they have the internal locus of control to make these changes at home because it is a lot of work. I oftentimes tell parents it's no more work than what you're already doing, but it is a change, and human beings aren't super great at change. So, having some support, problem solving before you really start making changes at home is really, really helpful, and really sets the whole family up for some success to feel better. And then we also have individual therapy where we're assessing and we're addressing the root cause, which is usually some form of anxiety. So, when I talk about root cause and anxiety, it can be a variety of things. We have, separation anxiety that we see that a lot, kindergarten, first and second grade. We also see it a lot if there has been a recent death in the family. It doesn't, when I say that, I don't mean like parent passing away. I mean a family pet, a grandparent, an auntie, somebody who's close to the family because the child is becoming aware that we're not immortal. Um, and then there's this kind of, OCD or OCP. So obsessive compulsive disorder is kind of a brain wiring thing, but there's also obsessive compulsive personality disorders. And when we see that, we oftentimes label that perfectionism. And so if you are going to school and you're going to be sitting down to take a test, you may want to avoid going to school if you don't feel like you're going to pass that test, or if you're worried about somebody judging you for how you do on a test, or there's a spring concert and you're going to sing and it's just too much for you. Um, and then there's the social anxiety, and social anxiety can come from peer relationships, but it can also just kind of develop on its own without anything major happening with peers. So I always like to remind parents that, this isn't anyone's fault. It's just kind of how their anxiety formed over time. A lot of agencies have group therapy where the child really works on developing some coping skills and some calming skills to address the anxiety. Um, Children, we don't oftentimes think about occupational therapy, but OTs are really effective at understanding how the central nervous system works. And when that central nervous system becomes hyperactivated, they have some really great techniques to help it calm down. But there, you're going to want to talk to your physician, and talk about like how to access those services if that's an evaluation that's necessary. And then there's always medications. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't say that, people need medications, but, sometimes people are like, well, I need to wait for psychiatry. It's going to be about 6 to 9 months. And we always say psychiatry is great. They're the brain experts. You want a brain expert for sure. But oftentimes, your pediatrician or your primary care doctor can make some recommendations to get things started while you're waiting to see that brain specialist. And then sometimes you don't even need to because what they did worked. So, um, but again, I think a lot of those conversations with doctors is just really helpful. I'm keeping an eye on time. I'm about a minute over where I'm supposed to be. So, I also have some resources here. I've shared that with the team. They're going to be getting some resources out to you. I think the big one is the nurtured heart approach for parents who really want to look at like, I need a different parenting technique because what I have been doing feels like a mismatch of a bunch of different things. What I like about the nurtured heart approach is it gives you kind of the step by step instruction on what to do and how to do it, but he also tells you why you're doing it. So you gain some agency about when you want to implement a certain strategy with your kid to kind of help them through their emotions and their feelings. Um, and then there's some online articles that are really helpful as well. Ooh, okay, so that is the end of the presentation.